The contract. Sarah had been unemployed for far too long. After months of fruitless job applications and interviews that went nowhere, she finally got an email that changed everything. The subject line read, "Your application has been accepted," and for the first time in a long while, a wave of hope flooded her chest. She had applied for an administrative position at a tech firm called Turnus Solutions, a mysterious but highly regarded company. The pay was generous, and the perks were too good to ignore. No one had heard much about Turnus. Its online presence was minimal, and the company's headquarters were located in a remote, quiet part of the city. But Sarah didn't care. This was the break she had been waiting for. The contract she signed that day seemed straightforward. There was one rule that stood out: never quit. It wasn't something that worried her. She'd worked long enough to know that every job came with rules. But this one, it was oddly phrased, as if quitting was a very real option, and yet the company's expectations of her were crystal clear. That first morning, Sarah arrived at the office early, eager to make a good impression. The building looked normal from the outside, a sleek modern structure with large glass windows. Inside, the lobby was quiet, almost too quiet. A receptionist, a woman in her late 20s with strikingly pale skin, greeted her with a cold smile and handed her a badge that read, "Welcome, Sarah. Your name is your identity." It was strange, but she brushed it off. Her new boss, Mr. Blythe, was the one who handed her the orientation packet. He was tall, with sharp features and a cold, calculating gaze. He explained the company's goals in vague terms and reassured her that the work would be easy, just basic administrative tasks. "Just follow the rules, and you'll fit in fine," he said, with a strange intensity in his eyes. The first rule was clear: never leave the building before 7 p.m. Sarah found it odd, but when she asked him why, he only smiled and said, "It's just a part of our company culture. We want to ensure productivity and focus." He said it with such sincerity that she didn't question it further. Her first few days were uneventful, though there was something undeniably unsettling about the place. The other employees were distant, barely interacting with her, except when necessary. The office felt sterile, clean, clinical even, and the air always had the faint scent of something she couldn't quite place. The most bizarre thing? No one ever seemed to leave. Whenever she glanced out the window, there was always the same stretch of street, always empty. No cars moved, no pedestrians walked. The city beyond seemed frozen in time. The second day, she saw a co-worker slip something under his desk, a small black book. Curious, Sarah walked by his cubicle later and peeked inside. The book was the same as the one in the contract she had signed, a small leather-bound volume with strange symbols etched on its cover. She tried to ask him about it, but he quickly closed the drawer and gave her a warning glance. "We don't talk about the book," he said, his voice low. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. One evening, as the clock neared 7 p.m., Sarah ventured into the hallway, intent on leaving. She walked toward the front doors, but to her surprise, they wouldn't open. She tried again, her frustration growing as she pulled at the handle. Still, it wouldn't budge. She turned around and found her co-worker, the one with the book, standing in the hallway. His expression was unreadable, but there was a sense of urgency in his voice when he spoke. "You can't leave before 7, he said, his tone flat but firm. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way. But if you try to leave, something will happen. You'll disappear." Sarah laughed nervously, thinking he was joking. "What are you talking about?" she asked, but her voice betrayed the unease bubbling up inside her. "Just follow the rules," he whispered, and everything will be fine. But Sarah was not a person to follow blindly. She pulled at the door again, harder this time. The pressure in her chest mounted. Something wasn't right. Her palms began to sweat as the seconds ticked by. Suddenly, the office lights flickered. The doors swung open on their own. She stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to step through. Something in her gut told her that leaving might not be as simple as it seemed. But the fear of being trapped, of being stuck in that sterile, soulless place forever, made her move. Sarah walked out into the cool evening air, breathing deeply, as if she had just escaped a nightmare. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing unusual, just the normal city streets. But then, she heard a whisper in the wind. "You've broken the rule." That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. A sense of unease had settled over her, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw flashes of Mr. Blythe's cold smile. The next morning, she returned to the office, only to find that things had shifted. The receptionist at the front desk was gone. In her place was a new woman, pale and even more expressionless than the last. Sarah tried to ask about her predecessor, but the new woman only shook her head. "Don't ask questions," she said softly, her eyes empty. The workday itself was a blur. Sarah felt more like a cog in a machine than ever before, with every task falling under the same mechanical rhythm. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. By mid-afternoon, Sarah felt it. The walls were closing in. The air was thick with tension, and her fellow employees no longer seemed like people. They were shells, moving, breathing shells, who followed every rule without question. As the day drew to a close, Sarah made her way toward the exit, determined to leave on time. She approached the front door, but this time, it was locked. She turned, looking around for someone, anyone to explain what was going on. But the lobby was empty. Silence pressed in around her. A chill ran down her spine. She ran back down the hallway, searching for a way out. But every door she tried was locked. The elevator wouldn't move. She was trapped, and she could feel it. They were watching her. The whisper returned. "You broke the rule." She stumbled backward and collided with something solid. Spinning around, she saw a figure standing in the doorway of the break room. Mr. Blythe. His eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. "I told you, Sarah," he said, his voice smooth and unwavering. "You cannot leave. Not without permission. Not without following the rules." Fear constricted around her chest. "What do you want from me?" she gasped, backing away. "You are here to serve a purpose," he replied, his tone cold. "We all are." In that moment, Sarah understood. The job wasn't just a job. The company was a trap, and quitting wasn't an option. Because those who tried, those who rebelled, were absorbed into the company. They became part of the building, their souls stripped away, their identities erased. And now, Sarah was a part of it. No longer just an employee, but an eternal part of the entity that controlled everything. "You signed the contract," Mr. Blythe continued, his smile stretching unnaturally wide. "And now you must follow the rules, or you'll become like the others." Sarah's pulse raced as the walls around her seemed to close in, the building pulsating with dark energy. The whispers grew louder. Her body froze. The doors opened behind her, the sunlight from the outside world almost blinding. But there was no escape. The only rule was clear. She couldn't quit. Clockwork. Jake had always prided himself on being punctual, so when he was offered a high-paying position as the night manager of a prestigious timekeeping company, he was thrilled. The salary was incredible, and the rules seemed simple. Arrive on time, leave on time, and always follow the clock. At first, Jake thought little of the cryptic nature of the company. The office building was immaculate, with row upon row of ticking clocks, all perfectly synchronized. His desk was pristine, and his tasks were manageable. Check the inventory, monitor the time logs, and ensure everything ticked smoothly. But as Jake spent more time at the company, things started to get strange. His co-workers were distant, speaking only in measured tones, and never deviating from their routines. The clocks, which once seemed comforting, now felt oppressive. Some of them started to run backward, others paused for inexplicable stretches of time. On his third day, Jake noticed something unsettling. Every time he tried to leave, the building seemed to shift. He'd turn a corner, only to find himself back where he started. His hours were slipping away, but the clocks kept ticking as if time had stopped for him. He asked his boss, Mr. Grayson, why the clocks were malfunctioning, but the answer was simple. Time must always be kept in balance. Desperate to escape, Jake tried leaving earlier, against company policy, but as he passed the front door, it slammed shut before his fingers could touch the handle. The clocks began to accelerate, ticking louder and faster until they became an unbearable hum. That night, Jake stayed late, hoping to fix the problem. Instead, he stumbled upon a horrifying truth. The company wasn't just selling clocks. It was feeding off time itself. Each worker was bound to the company, and the clocks were not measuring time. They were stealing it. With every passing hour, Jake felt his life draining away. He tried to break free, but the company wasn't built to let anyone go. His time was already consumed, and now he was trapped forever. Another cog in the clockwork. The silence room. Max's new job was simple enough. He was hired as a night guard for a high-security facility. The contract had a few strange stipulations, but nothing that seemed worth questioning. Rule number 1, never speak while on duty. Rule number 2, never leave the premises. Max found these odd, but easy to follow. The building itself was imposing, a labyrinth of long corridors and heavy steel doors. The silence was absolute. At first, Max assumed it was just because the facility was so secure, but as the nights dragged on, something about the stillness began to unsettle him. One evening, as he sat in the security room monitoring the cameras, Max heard faint whispers coming from the walls. At first, he dismissed them as the building's creaks and groans, but the whispers grew louder, and the more he listened, the clearer they became. Someone, or something, was calling his name. Max resisted the urge to speak, following the rules, but the whispers didn't stop. In fact, they became more insistent, urging him to break the silence. On the fourth night, Max snapped. He couldn't take it anymore. He shouted, "Who's there?" The response was immediate. The room around him began to tremble. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls twisted unnaturally. Max tried to run, but the doors wouldn't open. He was trapped. From the darkness, a figure emerged, pale, gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It was the facility's warden, but something was horribly wrong with him. His voice, when he spoke, was distorted, as if it came from deep within the earth. "You broke the rule," the warden intoned, "and now you're part of the silence." Max struggled, but he couldn't move. The whispers returned, louder than ever, as the walls seemed to close in on him. The room was alive, and now, so was Max. The unseen boss. Liz had always dreamed of working at a prestigious company, and when she was offered a position at Raventech, she was overjoyed. The company was shrouded in mystery, but it was said to be one of the most successful and innovative firms in the world. The pay was amazing, and the perks were beyond anything she had ever imagined. But the contract came with one strange rule: never ask about the CEO. At first, Liz didn't think much of it. Every company had its own peculiarities, right? But as the days went by, she began to notice something strange. Her co-workers were all uniform in their behavior, distant, polite, and cold. They never talked to each other, except in the most formal manner. The office was filled with shadows, as if the company itself was trying to remain hidden from the outside world. Curious, Liz started to ask questions. She wanted to know more about the company's history, its culture, its leadership. But every time she did, the conversation would abruptly end. Her colleagues would change the subject, their eyes darting nervously around the room. Then, one day, Liz accidentally stumbled upon the CEO's office. It was at the end of a long hallway, tucked away behind a set of double doors that were always locked. As she approached, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if something was watching her from inside. Before she could reach for the door handle, she heard a voice behind her. "Liz, don't go in there," a co-worker said, his voice barely a whisper. But it was too late. Liz stepped inside. The room was empty. No furniture, no lights, only a single chair facing the wall, and then the chair began to turn. Liz gasped as the figure in the chair slowly rotated to face her, the CEO. But it wasn't a person, it was something else, something ancient and wrong. "You shouldn't have asked," the CEO said in a voice that seemed to echo from all corners of the room. Liz's heart raced. She tried to run, but the doors slammed shut, trapping her inside. And as she looked into the CEO's eyes, she realized that she had become part of the company. Nothing more than a cog in a machine that had been feeding off its employees for centuries. The distant voice. Alan had always prided himself on his work ethic. When Renowned Technologies offered him a high-paying position in their operations department, he didn't think twice. The contract was simple enough: complete a few regular tasks, oversee company operations, and make sure everything ran smoothly. The rules were strict, but seemed manageable. Never speak to anyone outside the building. Follow the system, and you'll succeed. Renowned Technologies had always been a quiet, mysterious company, but its reputation was stellar. It was the type of place where innovation thrived. The building was sleek and modern, standing tall in the heart of the city. Alan's role didn't require much interaction with others, but he felt secure in his position. The pay was fantastic, and the office was pristine, almost too pristine, empty, as if it were more of a showroom than a workplace. But within the first few days, Alan noticed something strange. The employees were distant, their conversations clipped and professional. They never spoke outside of work hours, and no one ever discussed personal matters. The first time Alan tried to make casual conversation with a colleague, they responded with an unnerving look, then quickly turned back to their work. It wasn't just that the office was quiet, it was the overwhelming silence that seemed to stretch for miles. He would walk down the hallways and hear nothing, not even the sounds of footsteps echoing in the massive building. Alan began to feel as if he were alone in the world. One day, as he sat in his office, reviewing some data, he heard a faint voice coming from the hallway. He paused, straining to listen. The voice was distant, muffled, but unmistakable. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were unclear. Intrigued and confused, Alan stood up and approached the hallway. The voice seemed to be coming from a conference room up ahead, one that he knew was never in use. As he crept closer, the voice became more distinct, and his heart began to race. "Are they still following the rules?" the voice asked. Alan froze. The voice wasn't coming from any employee, and it didn't sound human. It was deep and gravelly, as though it echoed from the walls themselves. The second voice responded, equally as strange. "Yes, they're complying. Everything is as it should be." Alan's curiosity got the better of him. He pushed open the door to the conference room, only to find the room empty. No one was there, but the voice didn't stop. "You shouldn't be here," a voice echoed from the walls. Suddenly, Alan felt a strange compulsion to leave, but his feet wouldn't move. He tried to scream, but no sound came from his mouth. The building seemed to press in on him, suffocating him with its silence. He was caught in a void, a place where reality and time didn't quite align. The lights flickered, and for a split second, the room was filled with shadows that danced unnaturally, their forms shifting in and out of existence. Then, in a flash, the voice came again, louder this time. "You've broken the rule, Alan," it said. His heart thudded painfully in his chest. He turned to run, but the door slammed shut on its own, trapping him inside. As the voice grew louder and more frantic, Alan realized something horrifying. He wasn't alone in the building after all. Something had been watching him the entire time. Desperate, he pulled at the door, but it wouldn't budge. He pounded on the walls, but the room seemed to expand and contract, as though it was alive. The whispers continued, growing more frantic with each passing second. "The system is in place," the voice whispered. "You are now part of it." Alan's vision began to blur, and his body grew heavy, as if something was draining his energy. The shadows in the corners of the room flickered, and then, with one final deafening scream, everything went silent. The next morning, the company's operations seemed normal again. Alan's colleagues were back at their desks, as if nothing had happened. They barely acknowledged his presence, and their faces were blank, lifeless. Alan couldn't remember how much time had passed since he'd heard the voice, but when he looked at the company's systems, something had changed. His name no longer appeared on any of the files. His office was gone. The system had absorbed him. He had broken the rule, and now he was nothing but a shadow in the walls. The hidden room. Sophie had never been one to shy away from new opportunities. When she was recruited by Horizon Architects, a firm known for designing the most breathtaking skyscrapers in the world, she couldn't believe her luck. The contract was straightforward, and the pay was substantial. The only condition? Never enter the back rooms without permission. At first, Sophie thought little of the strange rule. After all, many firms had areas restricted to higher-ups, and it wasn't uncommon to be denied access to certain spaces. But from the very first day, something about the atmosphere at Horizon felt off. The office was pristine, immaculate even, but it had an air of coldness that Sophie couldn't shake. The employees were polite, but distant, and there was a pervasive sense of secrecy that hung in the air. Sophie's days were filled with designing blueprints, drafting proposals, and attending meetings. Yet, she couldn't help but notice the oddities. The hallways felt too long, and the rooms too empty. Despite the impressive futuristic technology the firm used, there were rooms she was never allowed to enter. They were located in the farthest corners of the building, hidden behind unmarked doors and locked tight at all times. The first time Sophie saw one of these doors, she asked her colleague, Marcus, what was behind it. His eyes widened for a moment before he glanced around nervously. "You don't want to know," he said, almost in a whisper. "It's not for us to see." Sophie's curiosity only deepened. But she didn't question the rule, at least not at first. Days turned into weeks, and the feeling of unease grew. Sophie's colleagues seemed robotic, never deviating from their routines. There were hushed conversations in the corners of the office, and once, Sophie swore she overheard someone mentioning the project. But when she asked them about it, they immediately clammed up, changing the subject as though she hadn't spoken at all. Then one night, after everyone else had left, Sophie's curiosity got the better of her. She decided to explore the hidden areas of the building. Her heart raced as she walked down the dark hallways, the fluorescent lights above flickering ominously. She came to a locked door, the one no one ever spoke of. The door opened with ease, and she stepped inside. What she found was far beyond anything she could have imagined. The room was filled with massive blueprints for buildings that shouldn't have existed. They were architectural designs that defied logic, structures that bent reality, buildings with rooms that could never be built, towers that spiraled into impossible angles, and bridges that seemed to go nowhere. As Sophie examined the blueprints, she felt a chill run down her spine. The designs were wrong. They were alive. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her, and Sophie spun around. Standing in the doorway was her boss, Mr. Hargrove, his face pale and his eyes dark with something she couldn't quite place. "You weren't supposed to see this," he said softly, his voice low and unsettling. Sophie tried to speak, but words failed her. She backed away, feeling as if the walls themselves were closing in on her. "This project is bigger than you think," Mr. Hargrove continued, stepping closer. "Horizon Architects doesn't just build structures, Sophie. We design realities." Sophie's pulse raced as she realized the truth. The company wasn't just creating buildings. They were creating gateways, portals to other dimensions. The designs weren't meant for human eyes, and the buildings they created weren't of this world. She turned to run, but the room seemed to expand, its walls stretching further and further. The doors wouldn't open. She was trapped, the air thick with a strange energy. "You're part of it now," Mr. Hargrove said. "You crossed the line, and now you'll never leave." The lights flickered, and Sophie screamed, but no sound came from her mouth. Her vision blurred, and she felt herself sinking into the floor, the room folding around her. By morning, Sophie's desk was empty. The blueprints she had seen were gone. No one seemed to remember her. Horizon Architects had claimed another soul. The Watcher. Nathan had always been drawn to financial markets, so when Aldridge Financial offered him a position as a financial analyst, he jumped at the chance. The salary was more than he'd ever dreamed of, and the office was sleek, modern, and filled with cutting-edge technology. The rules were simple: never leave early, never question the system. But from the very first day, something about Aldridge Financial unsettled Nathan. The employees were cold, robotic, and spoke in hushed tones. They never deviated from their routines, their expressions distant and controlled. The company's work culture was strict, and everyone followed the rules without exception. One day, Nathan was given an assignment to review a set of financial projections, but when he opened the files, he found them to be full of strange numbers, impossible calculations, vast sums of money that seemed to disappear into thin air. As he dug deeper, he discovered something even more disturbing. The numbers didn't just add up to profits, they created patterns, coded messages that seemed to point to something far more sinister. It was then that Nathan first noticed something. There was always someone watching him. At the end of each day, as he worked late into the evening, Nathan would feel eyes on the back of his neck. He would glance up from his computer and find one of the employees standing in the doorway, watching him without saying a word. Every time he asked if they needed something, they would simply walk away, their expressions vacant. His unease grew, but it wasn't until one late night that he discovered the truth. Nathan had stayed late to finish a report when he noticed a strange door at the back of the office, a door he had never seen before. It was hidden behind a set of filing cabinets, its surface smooth and unmarked. Against his better judgment, Nathan approached it. The door creaked open, revealing a dark staircase that led down to the building's depths. Unable to resist his curiosity, Nathan descended into the unknown. The basement was cold, damp, and filled with an unsettling energy. As he moved further into the depths, he saw something that made his blood run cold. There were monitors lining the walls, lost security footage. The monitors were displaying something more disturbing. Images of the employees, but their faces were twisted, their eyes hollow and empty. And then Nathan saw it. The Watcher. A figure stood in the center of the room, its face hidden in the shadows. It wasn't human. Its form flickered like a glitch in reality, a being that didn't belong to this world. As Nathan took a step back, the figure turned, its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. "You've been asking questions," it said, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, but rather a series of whispers overlapping each other. "And now, you'll never leave." Nathan tried to scream, but his voice was stolen from him. The Watcher moved closer, its form distorting and shifting. Nathan could feel his consciousness slipping away, his very being unraveling.